Okay, the Quran says that Jesus didn't die on the cross. What would you say to those folks?
Well, first of all, the Quran has two passages, one that implies he did die, one that implies he did not die, but I'd say it's beside the point. The Quran is written in the 7th century. That's 6.5 centuries after the cross. By historical standards, I find it hard to believe that the Quran has much to contribute to an event that happened 6.5 centuries earlier.
What do you think, Tony?
Well, there's very... the Prophet's knowledge of... anything very much, but certainly knowledge of, say, the Old Testament, insofar as it existed in that form, is sketchy, to put it mildly.
And you accept the fact that he died on the cross?
Oh, gosh, yes.
In 1985, 15 years ago, we had a Q&A from the crowd, and one of the students said they must have taken the wrong impression, but they said, so you believe Jesus didn't die on the cross? And I distinctly remember him calling the swoon theory rubbish.
Yeah. Now, John Dominic Crossan, although he would admit that Christ died on the cross, says he was probably laid over in some trash heap and torn apart by the dogs. He doesn't believe this tomb idea. Now, the tomb in which Jesus was buried, talk about that. What's the evidence?
Yeah, the burial.
Well, okay. First of all, let's get him buried. Was he buried in a tomb? What's the evidence for that?
Well, the interesting thing about Crossan is very few of his colleagues agree with him here. There's not a bit of evidence, not a bit, that says that Jesus was buried in an unknown plot and chewed up. And there's a lot of data to think that he was, let's put it this way, the data I'll get to in a second on the empty tomb all argues that he was buried in a separate plot. But there's not any data. And you know, it's usually the Christians. We're often thought of as Christians being put back on their heels saying, where's the data, where's the data? But I wonder where Dr. Crossan says he was buried in a common grave and chewed up by dogs. I think it's real easy. You say, give me one source.
All right, Tony, are we still on board on this one so far?
Well, I should have thought that this sort of detail is something which we're entirely dependent on the gospel evidence, aren't we? This sort of point.
Are we?
I disagree.
All right, why?
No, I disagree.
Talk to your buddy there.
Yeah, we'll talk to my buddy.
Yeah.
All right. Two examples. Yeah. Acts 13, not the book of Acts, but in Acts there are a lot of creedal passages, small creeds. And in Acts 13, we are told that he was laid in a tomb and God raised him, so we have an empty tomb. Back to our buddy Paul, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul uses a long sentence with what's called a triple hoti clause. In the Hebrew, it reads like, the Hebrew thinking, but in the Greek, it reads like this. Paul says, he died for our sins according to the Scriptures, he was buried, and that he was buried, and that he was raised, and that he appeared. So if you've got a person who's dead, buried, raised, and appears, it's very hard to imagine that sequence without what going down is what's coming up. So I think Paul's very clear that what went down is what comes up. You've got this and, triple hoti clause. He died. He was buried. He was raised. He appeared. And you got Philippians 3:11 again, ekanastasis, coming out from among the dead. How you can have that combination to be a Pharisee and believe that something comes down is not coming up, I think we do have Paul on the empty tomb.
Yeah, and that goes back, if he wrote it 55, he preached it in 51, and he got it from Peter in 35. Peter had to get it from someplace, and he said all the boys were preaching the same thing.
Sure. And you got that early text in Acts 13. But this is Paul on the empty tomb. I think we've got a number of other reasons for believing in the empty tomb also.